Well,
All right, good evening. Thank you all for coming this evening. We don't yet have a quorum, but we'd like to go ahead and get started with public comment, which we can do without a quorum. And with that, let's see, Cecile McHugh?
no, I'm sorry, I didn't check the box to speak.
Oh, I'm sorry, gotcha. I see this, okay. Okay, Sarah Vanderwitten?
Where do you want me to be? Can I just sit here?
Sure, where we like.
I'll sit down, take my mask off. Okay. So I'm speaking from the point of view of people who are against the retention of the 3 unrelated rule and the definition of family, because that limits the possibilities for people who need to join together in order to have some degree of housing affordability. And it seems like the problem of that is behind the desire to keep those rules is pretty limited to the university situation and student housing. I've looked at the papers that were attached to the agenda, the case law on community residences and zoning code definition of family. And I'm struggling to understand it, and I just have some questions because I'm struggling to find where in those documents is support for keeping the 3 unrelated rule in Evanston. In the inclusive definition of family or household, the indication is that a cap is good and necessary because without it, the city cannot zone or regulate for more than 4 people, assuming there's, let's say 3, because that's what our situation is. Can't regulate for more than 3 people with disabilities. There's no explanation of why it can't. It just says, that is a requirement in order for the city to be able to regulate against and to protect people with disabilities from scams and so on. It's really unclear why that particular requirement is necessary for that kind of protection. Any rate, so under that paper, that particular piece of paper, the cap is good. We don't want community residences to be considered under the family provision because then they can't be regulated for some reason. But then, in the case law on community residences and zoning code, I have to read this as saying you think the cap is, that no cap is good, that the cap is not a good idea. Because you're saying if there is no cap and the community residences are treated just like families, then the city can't exclude them from residential areas, which I would think would be what you would want. In the second point, the second bullet point on that page, it says if there's a cap and the residence has more people than the cap, then they can be allowed under the reasonable accommodation principle. But if they're within the cap, like under 3 people, then they can't be more highly regulated than other families. Again, that doesn't say why there needs to be a cap. It just says that if there's more people than the cap, then there's another way for them to be able to manage under reasonable accommodation. Under the third bullet point, you say there's basically no need for definition of family. When there's no definition of family, there's no basis for exclusion wherever there's residential zoning. So I'm struggling to understand how these things are consistent and what you're actually saying and what your reasoning is for why a cap is necessary in order to protect group homes. It just doesn't compute, and maybe I'm not getting, I read the City of Chicago Heights, that did not seem to support that description or that characterization. And I just would like to know how the cap of 3 unrelated people will actually help people in need of group homes. It's a mystery to me, and what you wrote doesn't help. So I would like that to be clarified. Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, and Wayne, I'm sorry.
When?
Win?
We know that it works, but I just want to make sure it goes.
In order to test the microphone. It works, and your questions will be answered in the presentation.
It should continue to work, just turn it on. It's been working since earlier today. You're very welcome.
Yes, I'm pleased to see that you're taking up these two topics tonight. It's been a while that the committee's been meeting, and I'm really glad you're here to do this. I would like the subcommittee to clarify what is the problem being addressed by the free unrelated rule. What do you find the problem it is, and is this the proper tool to deal with the problems that you see, or is it too blunt and not very specific? Is property damage, noise, overcrowding, health and sanitary conditions, are those the problems of free unrelated? There are more specific tools to deal with these issues of nuisance, health, and safety measures. Use the ordinance that directly apply to the problems. Evanston has a portion of the population struggling with affordability and housing. Allowing people to form households to lessen the cost, dropping the free unrelated rule will help to mitigate the cost of living in Evanston. And I would like to take up your invitation to find another consultant to come and speak to the issues of this. So thank you for offering that.
Has anyone else come in since that would like to speak?
Yeah.
Okay. Bonnie, of course. And Tina after. And Carl. Carl, okay.
That's it. Does that sound you better?
That's fine, yeah. And someone next, sorry, your name?
Yeah, Max.
Max?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Bonnie Wilson. I've been a real estate agent in Evanston for over 35 years, and I've lived in Evanston for 47 years. I was the township assessor, so probably know. I'm now living in the first ward, lived in the third ward for over 45 years. As a real estate agent in Evanston, I have several clients who would like to buy a home in Evanston and share a home with 4 to 6 unrelated women. They would not be able to share a home now because of the 3 unrelated ordinance. This is the times when more and more individuals want to share their living expenses with others. I know of a rental agency where they also got an email that this woman would like to rent a place with other like-minded women to rent a home together. Can't do that now. That is why I fully support the city staff on the new this is a speech I gave July of last year. And the staff put together taking away the 3 unrelated and what you can do to verify, to take away the 3 unrelated and the definition of family. So I want to say I support the city staff on the new definitions of family. The definition for family will be removed, and definitions for single family, 2-family, multifamily buildings will be changed to single unit, 2-unit, multi-buildings. Also, any reference to family will be updated to dwelling unit. Any reference to family will be removed from zoning. Plus, over-occupancy enforcement will be based on the recently property maintenance code square footage requirements. So that's my statement, and I did that in July, and I say it again today.
Thank you very much. Cheryl Lawrence?
Yep.
My name is Cheryl Lawrence, and I'm an Evanston resident. I work in Evanston. I'm the executive director of Open Communities, and this is an issue. We work on housing issues, not only fair housing issues, but housing counseling issues, and this particular ordinance is one that just it doesn't fit with our times and the needs of our community. The cost of housing is simply too expensive to expect that many senior citizens, students, and even many middle income people, including teachers and others, can afford to live in Evanston without sharing expenses. In punishing so many who need housing on the premise that a home around the university might become a party house does not comport with fair and equitable housing. And, you know, this is a situation where we really need to engage Northwestern, you know, to help with some of these issues. And we have other housing ordinances in place that should take care of nuisance and, you know, and other issues. And so we need to work around, you know, other solutions besides keeping this, you know, in our vernacular in this community. Really, you know, it affects, you know, many seniors who are priced out of the market and they need options for home sharing. As others pointed out, it's, you know, I mean, many of our kids have moved away, and, you know, they're not available to us. And so as we age, you know, we want to be able to live with other like-minded, you know, people and share expenses. And, you know, it's a want, but it's also becoming more and more and more of a necessity. The other thing is that, you know, sort of the idea of a rooming house, you know, we all remember that term, and it just seems inevitable that in many communities, not just in, you know, affluent communities like Evanston, but all over the United States, I mean, this is going to become more and more of a choice and a need. So, you know, we have led the efforts in many areas, and this is one where, you know, we can do better, we should do better. And, you know, as far as zoning goes, you know, we should deal with, you know, we agree that the zoning laws, you know, that have more objective criteria, you know, should be also used for, you know, square footage occupancy, bedroom occupancy, something more objective than 3 unrelated. You know, I'm part of the LGBTQ community and know lots of folks that, you know, this type of law can affect and be very detrimental. So I expected more conversation than starting with comments. So, you know, there's other articles that have been out that have been very, very good about the reason why this should go away. And if I can answer any housing questions, I'm happy to do that as well.
You please share those if you will with me, and I can share them. I mean, I'll give you the articles.
Okay, great. Thank you
very much,
for your time.
Tina, take it.
Good evening. For those who don't know me, I'm Tina Payton, local landlord here in Evanston, who provides a lot of affordable housing. So the changes to, I apologize, I didn't read the packet, but from what I remember from previous meetings, you want to change it to a maximum of 8 people, a blanket statement, eliminate family, and then eliminate the 3 unrelated. What happens when you change it, it looks like that you're just changing it so that the landlords that are illegally renting to 3 unrelated Northwestern students primarily, that you're giving them a free pass now and you're making them in compliance. You already know property standards and the city of Evanston. You know who the people are in violation and do nothing about it right now on the books. There are people, they advertise $10,000 a month for one house, 9 bedrooms. You know that is not a single family renting for $10,000 a month. That's 10 students for $1,000 apiece. Those people are in violations. Those advertisements are regularly on the internet every year, all year, for Northwestern students. And then you complain that they're having all these parties and disrupting the neighborhoods for the people that live there, which is happening and is unenforced. So when you change this 3 unrelated, you're giving them a free pass to do whatever they want to. As usual, always an exception for Northwestern. Number 2, you change the ADUs to allow ADUs. For a long time, you could not rent ADUs unless it was family members. Now you're saying, oh, all of these ADUs, we want to add them for low-income people. I would like to know how many ADUs are rented to low-income people. It looked like you just gave a free pass to people with coach houses with a lot of money to be in compliance. Because they were legal before, you didn't enforce it, and it's still this, now they got a free pass to continue to do what they were doing all along, was renting them out. So give us some statistics about how this is gonna help low-income people. Number 3, I was the only person here in Evanston, landlord, to rent on the TIBA program at Connections for the Homeless, a family of 9. There's very few 3 and 4 bedroom homes, and family is very important. So let's say you put a maximum of 8 people. What happens to people with 9 or 10 in their family that are related? Those people have different company than people, Northwestern students having big parties in their place. And you just want to talk about low income and helping them? I helped them on the program, and I was in compliance. Now, another situation with that same family. I had a 4-bedroom, and Property Standards decided they wanted to come and said my place was too many people. And they came in with a tape measure at my house on a program that the city approved. Are you gonna go over there and do this tape measuring and all this and say who's related and who's unrelated? No, you're not. You already don't have enough staff to do the work that you already supposed to do with property and standards. You don't have enough inspectors, and who's gonna be in charge of this? It's just a free-for-all for Northwestern students. So who will be enforcing these laws? It should not be. We should continue to family. This is a farce, what you're saying, all these homeless, saying that seniors need this and this. We have a lot of programs for seniors and all of this too. So it's just an excuse to give a pass to people to not follow the laws that are currently on the books. Should not be changed and should be enforced how it is right now.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Mr. Sutton.
Good afternoon. There are about 3 quick things I want to comment on. One, and I want to reinforce, how in the world can you bring up a definition of what a family is? The days of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel are over. Okay, there is no such a thing as the only family that should be recognized is mother, father, and children. Okay, with that out the way, anything that you add to that will never be able to be consistently enforced. And as Tina mentioned, if you can't enforce consistently with the same laws that you have on the books now, you will never ever, when you change, have any kind of equality or equity in enforcement. So, as we sit here today now deliberating what is a family, I think a family is anything that those people decide that they want to call. Whether they want to be married, whether they want to be gay, whether they want to be a rooming house, as long as their music is off at 11 o'clock at night, as long as they cut their grass, as long as they pay their property taxes, as long as they keep their utility bills on, it's none of your business. Secondly, the handouts that you've been giving to businesses in this community, I think is a slap in the face to small landlords who've been paying utilities, property taxes, and all kinds of improvements on our home, which require us hiring plumbers, electricians, and landscapers. Then I look at businesses that are just interrupted by a few weeks by you putting a new water line in, and you give them $50,000 each. No documentation. But when it comes to us, you ask for that pound of flesh and the merchant offenders. What's your tax return? What is this? What is that? Come on. You know, what kind of inconsistency do you continue to plan in this city The only thing I could see is this is a mechanism to increase and expedite gentrification to get poor black people like me out of the city. And I'm letting you know, you never pay any attention to what I say. The only reason I keep coming because I hope I prick your consciences for you sitting there thinking that you represent the people of Evanston and you're not doing anything but putting a burden on us that you give everybody a free ride with our taxpayers' money.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Sutton. Max?
So I'm Max Ulate. I'm a community organizer with Connections for the Homeless. I also grew up here in Evanston, which I'm very glad that I'm back now. And I just wanted to quickly say, speaking for joining forces for affordable housing, our affordable housing coalition that partners with Connections for the Homeless and different interest groups in our Evanston community, that we are in support of eliminating the 3 unrelated rule. Unnecessary burdens to housing, who can live there and who can't, creates a strain on our overall housing stock in the city. And the more housing we have available to all types of different groups of families, non-families, people that choose to live together, it's better for everyone, and it creates more affordable housing overall. So we would stress that this rule gets changed and we look at other burdensome zoning codes that restrict the amount of housing we have in the city of Evanston. Thank you.
Thank you. And anybody else here in the room? I have one person who emailed a statement. They asked me to read it to you. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Cecilia didn't hear my comments, but I remember from something I said last year. I grew up in an apartment in Chicago that just met the occupancy requirements that would be in effect if the definition of family was removed. It was barely enough space for our family, but it was workable because there were 2 adults and 6 children who were siblings. I shared a really small room with my sister, and the other brothers shared one large room, did meet the occupancy requirements. It was workable only because there were 6 children and we were siblings, and it simply is absolutely not enough space for the same number of adults. Thank you.
I have a statement here from Betsy Norman. She said, I'm reaching out on the issues that are currently being evaluated at the Housing Subcommittee, specifically on the impact of student housing in residential neighborhoods. I have lived in my home at 1733 Hinman Avenue since 2000. I grew up in Evanston as well and very intentionally chose to raise my children here. I became aware of the proliferation of student housing in residential neighborhoods and the resulting negative impact on quality of life unexpectedly. The house next to mine, 1727 Hinman Avenue, was sold last spring to an LLC. I later discovered that it was purchased by a couple for their daughter, now a rising sophomore at Northwestern. They plan to put on an addition with the goal to increase the size of the home to accommodate 5 bedrooms. In fact, the owner directly told another neighbor that they planned for 5 to 6 of the daughter's friends to move in. Needless to say, I was not thrilled. I recognize that living through neighbors' construction is part and parcel of home ownership. I have lived through my neighborhood's renovations and exposed them to my own. What concerned me was that it sounded like a de facto dorm without an RA was going to exist directly next to me. As the parent of 2 college students and another teenager, the idea of living next to a group of unsupervised teens, young adults, was highly unappealing, to say the very least. Not only did I question how it would impact my quality of life, I also wondered about how it would affect the value of my home, 2 issues of utmost importance. This remains to be seen, as under the duplicitous cover of making a, quote, multi-generational home, the architectural plans for 1727 were approved by the city's Preservation Commission, despite numerous objections, public commentary from virtually all the neighbors on the east side of our block. It's clear that real estate investors have already attacked in some areas of Evanston and are circling the waters in many others. Their goals are not to diversify neighborhoods or make affordable housing more of a reality. To the contrary, they are chopping up the houses and charging exorbitant rents to NU students who, more often than not, see these spaces not as homes, but as raucous social environments, leaving their neighbors with little recourse other than reaching out to the police. This is not what most people want to do, nor is it in the best interest of the community at large. I'm fortunate that, so far, I have not experienced the noise and disruption that has been so prevalent in the neighborhoods in and around Warrington Avenue. I remain hopeful that this will continue to be the case post-construction, when the number of students living at 1727 will increase exponentially. I want to be clear that I deeply value the diversity that Evanston offers. I would be more happy to have mixed income housing in my neighborhood, and in fact live across the street from a number of condominium complexes in the National Head in my neighborhood. And let's see, I would be more than happy to have mixed income housing in my neighborhood, and in fact live across the street from a number of condominium complexes and the national headquarters of fraternity. Further, I recognize that many Evanston housing statutes are not reflective of modern living arrangements, not to mention almost certainly have a history of discrimination at their root. I am fully supportive of updating our statutes, but I also feel that it's essential to think proactively about the unintended negative consequences of wiping away statutes without a thoughtful process of evaluation, assessment of the needs of all constituents, including homeowners. Thank you for your consideration. Any other? Yes, what is your name?
Hi, I'm Mary Kay Conlon, and I apologize if I don't have prepared remarks. I'm a homeowner of 34 years at 2205 Sherman Avenue, which is the block just south of Noyes, which is almost all what looks like large single-family homes, but in the 34 years that I've lived here, it has increasingly become absentee landlord student housing that is encroaching on our homes and neighborhood. We've been very lucky. The home next to us directly has done a good job of getting reasonably quiet students as it goes, but I do believe that they've cut that house into 3 parts, and they legally only have 2 entrances, but I do believe the fact that it is limited, and they know that the simple rule that there are only supposed to be 3 unrelated people in there keeps the lid on things a little bit over there. So I just don't know what the right answer is. I'm not trying to stymie you all, but I want you to understand, as a homeowner of 34 years paying my taxes, that the value of my home and the quality of life in my neighborhood is extremely impacted by student housing in my backyard on both sides. And finally, I would just concur with that last comment that I'd be more than happy to turn those places into, different kinds of income people living there than students, unsupervised students, when the landlord is simply there trying to get as much money out of these well-funded students as they can. It's not good for the students, and it's not good for the neighbors.
Thank you. Okay, would anybody else like to comment? So we don't have a quorum, so we won't vote on minutes, but I think we can go ahead and proceed with presentations because we won't take action this evening. We'll be just sharing information. So I think we'll go ahead. I'd like to therefore go ahead and introduce. We're very fortunate to have with us this evening Attorney Clanny Lober is with us. He has a long history of fighting for equity and integration in cities. In fact, even here in Evanston in the 70s and 80s, he was an active participant fighting for equity in zoning and integration in our city. His nearly 50 years he has nearly 50-year professional record of advancing social equity and inclusion, started well before the terms were invented, devising policies and practices to incorporate fair housing into routine planning and zoning practices, creating and preserving affordable housing even in the face of gentrification, achieving and maintaining racially and economically integrated communities, combating exclusionary zoning, and eliminating zoning that illegally excludes community residences for people with disabilities. He has been an expert witness on preserving affordable housing before both houses of Congress. Mr. Lober is uniquely qualified to advise us on the consequences of proposed changes to the definition of family and proposes to change or eliminate the definition. He is one of the nation's leading experts on this issue and the consequences of making the sort of changes that we're discussing here today and in subsequent meetings. He's been an expert witness in the oft-mentioned Seventh Circuit Valencia and Chicago Heights decisions. Mr. Lober identified the successful legal arguments regarding the definition of family that the plaintiffs used in both cases. He has developed a very inclusive definition of family, which he'll share with us this evening. He has conducted the requisite studies and drafted zoning amendments for community residences for people with disabilities, group homes, sober living homes, halfway houses, for countless cities and counties to bring them into compliance with the nation's Fair Housing Act. He has twice been a consultant to the state of Illinois on zoning for community residences and authored the model zoning for community residences for both the American Planning Association and the American Bar Association. The American Planning Association has recognized Mr. Lober and his work with 4 awards, including the 1998 Paul Davidoff Award for demonstrating a sustained social commitment to advocacy, planning, and support of the needs of society's less fortunate members. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for coming this evening, and Attorney Lober, Planner Lober, will now give a presentation on exactly what we've been discussing.
Okay. I've had a terrible cough for the past month. Can you hear me okay without the microphone? Okay, I'll try the microphone. Tell me if it's really irritating. Okay. First, I do want to tell Cheryl Lawrence I was good buddies with Raina Miller, founder of your organization, and I'm still good buddies with Gail Schechter. I'd like to still be buddies with Raina, except she died. And also make it very clear there's nothing sacrosanct about the number 3. The city could use a different number. But my purpose here is not to take a position on anything political. I'm not going to take a position on whether or not rooming houses should be allowed anywhere in the city, or mini dorms anywhere, or you should be able to live with 5 or 6 other people, or if you should be able to establish homeless shelters anywhere in the city. That's not my job here. That's not what the city retained me to do. I'm here to provide fact-based legal analysis that responsible governments would include in their decision-making process. Now, these proposals that have been made cannot be considered in a vacuum because they have serious consequences that city decision makers and the public need to understand. Unfortunately, the subcommittee is paying some attention. There is a planning adage that stated millennia ago in a galaxy far, far away. Better informed the decision makers be, the better decisions presumably they will make. I bet you did not know that Yoda came up with that. So I'm not going to, especially given the public comment, I'm not just going to make assertions. I'm going to explain the reasons for my conclusions in depth. So it may cure insomnia for some people, hopefully it won't, but I think it would be very irresponsible not to fully flesh out the bases of what I'm about to convey to you. This can get a little complicated. Law tends to be that way. I was a planner for 11 years before I went temporarily insane and got a law degree. At Northwestern. I lived in Evanston. Why couldn't they put the law school here? So first I'm going to summarize the consequences of adopting either of these proposals to eliminate the definition of family or eliminate the cap to the definition of family. That actually would reflect also about proposals to raise the cap to 8, which has very similar effects. I'm going to explain the terms that I'm using. I'm going to explain the factual and legal reasons that these consequences arise. And I'm going to offer up at the end innovative solutions that expand the definition of family while mitigating the adverse and unintended consequences that these proposals to abolish the definition of family or eliminate the cap on unrelated persons would produce. I want to make it really clear. It's up to you and the City Council to decide on the policy that you choose to go with. I'm providing you information so you can make a well-informed decision and understand that these proposals have consequences far beyond what's been talked about. So to be fully informed, it's really critical to understand what I'm afraid are, like climate change, some inconvenient truths. And I will explain the reasons behind this, but I want to get this up front. Abolishing the definition of family or eliminating the cap on the number of unrelated people that constitute a family would render Evanston's current zoning for community residences discriminatory on its face. The words in the ordinance would be discriminatory under the Fair Housing Act. It would invalidate Evanston's legal ability to require a license or certification for community residences and for recovery communities, which is a very similar use, which I'll explain shortly. It would allow community residences and recovery communities to locate anywhere in the city without licensing or certification, and historically it has consistently resulted in clustering of numerous community residences on a block and concentrations in neighborhoods, particularly in minority neighborhoods where, because of, I know I couldn't say this in Florida, but systemic racial discrimination has depressed property values due to the effects of segregation. So, community residences include group homes for people with disabilities who are unable to live on their own, people with mental illness, physical disabilities, the frailties of age. So a lot of small assisted living homes that are small enough to emulate a family are indeed community residences, because they're very big in Florida, for example. Sober living homes for people in recovery from substance use disorder are community residences. And halfway houses that are small enough to emulate a family. And we can feel very confident, given all the research, that a group of home or halfway house housing 10 people, very, very confident it can emulate a family. Maybe 12, getting beyond that, not so sure. I mean, I'm sure some of you have seen Cheaper by the Dozen. No one's old enough to remember that film. Even the remake, didn't Steve Martin do a remake? Or Yours, Mine, and Ours, the Lucille Ball film. They had 12 people in there. Interestingly, when I went to the Supreme Court for the Edmonds case, I did an amicus brief for the American Planning Association on regarding the Fair Housing Act. The APA was the only group, professional group, filing an amicus on the side of the Fair Housing Act. All the others were filing against the Fair Housing Act. Justice Scalia, rather conservative fellow, he got very upset when Edmonds, Washington said, we shouldn't have to allow this sober home here because they want to have 8 people in it and our average household size is just 2.3. Scalia's response was, I've got a family of 9. You mean we're not welcome in your town? He still voted against the Fair Housing Act. Politics and traditional philosophy sometimes triumph over reason. The other use that is related, that has become very big in Florida and Arizona and is coming in here in Illinois, are recovery communities. And that's where an operator takes an entire apartment building or developments or a series of single-family homes, townhomes that are semi-institutional, and fills them with people in recovery. And they're really pretty much a semi-institutional use. Here's a couple of examples, real-life examples from Florida. And what they do is they go in and put it, say your definition of family allowed 3 people, they would put 3 people in each apartment and say, you can't touch us. If you don't have a definition of family, or you have a cap of 8, they can put 8 people in each unit and say, you can't touch us. So zoning has to include coverage of recovery communities, which we started doing a couple of years ago when I finally figured out how you can do it. And it's withstood the court challenge. The important thing is if you And I will get into these reasons that Sarah was wanting to know. I'm starting to get into them. If you don't have any regulation of the community residences, you wind up with the situation they have in Naperville, where they don't have any regulation of community residences except to require a license, and you get clustering. So you've got several instances, you can see the X's. There's a couple of instances where you've got several on a block, and then you've got mostly in just a couple of neighborhoods. There were about 37 or 38 of them. This is from 2014. When we last checked the numbers there. And and you're probably scratching your heads, why do we care? And that's because clustering concentrations interfere with achieving the core aims of a community residence. The whole idea behind them, that Wolfensberger came up with in 1916, parents clearly had a sense of humor when they named them, was that people living in an institution, he was looking at people with developmental disabilities, just learned how to live in an institution. They never learned the life skills that you and I all take for granted, that we teach our kids, that enable them to live as independently as they possibly can. And I'm sure you're very well aware there's lots of people with autism that are living totally independently, doing just fine. But back in 1916, they would have been just tossed off into an institution. You may remember One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So some people who might be old enough to remember that, Jack Nicholson got an Oscar for playing himself. All they were doing there in the mental institution was learning how to live in a mental institution. They were never learning the life skills or relearning the life skills that they need to live as independently as they can on their own. So to do that, the whole idea behind the group home is to emulate a biological family, to achieve normalization, living as normal life as you can, and community integration, being fully integrated into the community, and using neighbors as role models. But clustering on a block, having 3 or 4 on a block, or concentrating in a neighborhood can interfere with achieving normalization, community integration, and using role models. People in the community residences, particularly people with developmental disabilities, and particularly people in recovery from substance use disorder, will almost certainly interact only with people in the other community residence that's nearby, and not utilize neighbors as role models. Plus, it can exceed the carrying capacity of the neighborhood to absorb service-dependent people into its social structure. I know that's sociology, and nobody believes in sociology anymore, but it's real. So, the other concern is people with disabilities, even people, including people with substance use disorder, are vulnerable populations. And they can be abused. These are real headlines from all over the country, not just Florida. There is incredible abuse going on, not just with people in recovery, but also people with developmental disabilities, and people with mental illness, and the frail elderly. We have a couple of group homes for the frail elderly in Clark County, where Las Vegas is, Clark County, Nevada. And the county turned them down, the operators down for new group homes because they weren't even providing air conditioning in their existing group homes for the frail elderly. And I think you could pretty well agree that would be elder abuse, especially in Nevada. So there's great concern. We've got tons of scammers, especially in the sober home industry. Kenny Chapman, who's referenced on the top, was the poster child of the scammers. He first started opening sober homes. They realized the real money was in the laboratories, where he was getting away with, and many of these operators would get away with, charging $4,500 for a week of testing for one person for urinalysis tests. The insurance companies were paying it. They finally stopped paying it, but they were paying it. And that should really tick you off if you've ever had a dispute with your insurance company over a legitimate bill. He negotiated a 13-year sentence with the feds. The judge didn't buy it and sentenced Kenny to 27.5 years and $536 million. And one of the things he was doing was keeping people on drugs, giving them drugs so they'd have to go back to detox. He was, a lot of the residents were being sexually abused. He was forcing some to work in labor pools, and most egregiously, he was forcing a lot of the women into prostitution. He was chaining them to their beds and forcing them into prostitution. So he was the worst of the worst. And that's without licensing. Licensing requirements, certification requirements, weed out these scam artists. And in the cities that I've worked with in Florida, and counties where they've adopted a sort of zoning that complies with the Fair Housing Act and requires licensing and certification, have seen the crooked operators leave them and go elsewhere where they aren't required to have licensing and certification. In Delray Beach, within a year of adopting the zoning ordinance that I worked with their staff on, that required all the sober home operators, all the community residences to get licenses and certification, the death rate from overdoses fell in half. And that's because most overdoses occur at the sober home or very close to it. And with the crooks leaving, you have legitimate operators where overdoses are very, very uncommon. So in Illinois, the big problem is we have very little oversight of sober homes and no oversight of recovery communities. There's no licensing or certification available for them. I spent several hours a year ago talking with people in the licensing division of the state government, and they didn't even know what recovery communities were. And their idea of licensing for the sober homes was just unbelievably minimal. It's really scary. You do a good job. They do a very, very good job in Florida. So if the community residences and recovery communities are going to effectively serve the residents with disabilities, it's really essential for any city to be able to keep them from just clustering together on a block and concentrating in the neighborhood, because it interferes with their ability to do their job, and to require that they have a license or certification in order to protect the people that are living in these homes. These are vulnerable people. So what gets things interesting now is here comes the Fair Housing Act. It was amended in 1988 by a bipartisan Congress. Some of you may remember those halcyon days, and even signed by Ronald Reagan, who was frankly no friend of fair housing, that added handicap to the list of protected classes. But it also made a few unique provisions. It required that you have to make reasonable accommodation in your rules, policies, and practices when it's needed to give people with handicaps, I'll call people with disabilities, an equal opportunity to enjoy a dwelling. That's where, and this complicates it all, and I know this is an unintended consequence that people advocating getting rid of the definition of family or getting rid of the cap in the definition of family never thought of. This creates a situation where without a definition of family or a cap, you can't require a license or certification of any community residence for people with disabilities. And you can't require, for example, a spacing distance to be a permitted use because of this basic principle that, and this is all the case law points at that, the zoning that treats people, a group of people with disabilities different than the same size group of people without disabilities is discriminatory on its face. It's not, and it's just the language in the zoning ordinance is discriminatory and in violation of the Fair Housing Act. However, most cities, overwhelmingly in this country, have a cap on the number of unrelated people. The Supreme Court ruled way back in 1974 in an opinion by Justice William O. Douglas, one of the great liberal icons of the court, in a 7-2 decision, that cities can have a cap on the number of unrelated people that constitute a family. In that particular case, it was a cap of 2. There aren't a lot of cities that have that right now. I'm working with a city in Florida that does have that. I'm trying to get them to increase it up to at least 4. The city of Chicago, where you lived, and where I also grew up, until they revised the ordinance about 20 years ago, it didn't allow any unrelated people to live together except for your maidservant and your manservant. It also prohibited flying a kite in Grant Park, and ugly people could be fined $10 for walking down the street. It's amazing Mayor Daley the First didn't get fined every day. I'm sorry, I can't help but pick on him. So the way the law works is if you fit within the cap in the city. So you say you have a city with a cap of 3. I'm just going to use 3 because that's what Evanston has. You perfectly reasonable to raise it to 4 or 5 if you wanted to. If it fits within that cap, it would be discriminatory to require spacing between group homes or a license because you're treating them differently than all other groups of 3 people. However, if you want to have more than 3 people in the community residence, that's when the Fair Housing Act's reasonable accommodation provision kicks in. And you can have spacing and licensing because ordinarily you wouldn't be allowing 3 unrelated people to live together at all. And that's where this whole catch gets in. If you don't have a definition of family, that means any number of unrelated people can live together. Okay? And if any number of unrelated people can live together, then it would be discriminatory on its face to require anything extra of community residences for people with disabilities. That's the plain, straightforward case law. If you have a definition of family that doesn't have a cap on the number of unrelated people, same situation, you would be violating the Fair Housing Act. And most of the cases where spacing and licensing have been thrown out, an overwhelming percentage of them, have been cases where the city did not have a definition of family, largely in New Jersey, or it did not have a limit on the number of people that could constitute, unrelated people that could constitute a family. This also, really started back in 1992 with the Easter Seals case. North Bergen didn't have a definition of family, which led to invalidation of its requirements for community residences. And this was just the tip of the iceberg. This is a list of a number of these cases in the handout for this that was included in the packet. These cases are listed plus a paragraph on each of them. In the Chicago Heights case, which Sarah noted, I was an expert witness for DOJ. And about 4 days before we had to submit the summary judgment briefs, it hit me like a bolt of lightning. And why it didn't hit me sooner, I don't know. The case involved Thresholds, which operates group homes for people with mental illness. They wanted to put in a home for 8 people. But it was 500 feet from an existing group home for 5 people with developmental disabilities. And these were people with profound developmental disabilities. They were all bedridden. And they were requiring a special use permit. But their definition of family allowed 5 unrelated people to live together. And suddenly hit me, oh my God, it's not a group home that exists there with the 5 people with developmental disabilities, it's a family. And the lawyer working on this at DOJ, Joe Lasser, took my ideas, turned it into a great brief, and we won the case very easily. On that basis. Same thing with Valencia versus City of Springfield. I was an expert witness for the operator, IG, before Springfield. Springfield's a terrible, bigoted city. I'm not afraid to say that on the record. They have a definition of family that allows 5 unrelated people to live together, but they always require a special use permit. So they don't recognize the legal principle. Our client opened a group home for 3 people with developmental disabilities. I think they all use wheelchairs. And was totally unaware that 168 feet away, on the other side of the street, was another group home for people with developmental disabilities. They discovered that each of them existed when one of the residents of that other home showed up knocking on the door of my client's home. So we went, sought the special use permit, got turned down, and went to court. Tom Kennedy is here to handle the legal case. and they kicked Springfield's butt. The great little secret that hasn't really come out much, I'll share it with you, is that Springfield gave us a smoking gun. I've always wanted to have a smoking gun. They had a letter from 1995 to the lawyer for Oxford House, which operates self-governed sober homes, telling them, you want to have 8 people in your Oxford House, but if you get it down to 5 people, you'll meet our definition of family and can just move in. Why I had that in my files, I don't know, but that really helped with the judge in the Valencia case. And we won that case. About 2 weeks ago, the plaintiffs were awarded $280,000 in damages. Sadly, one of the plaintiffs with developmental disabilities haven't died. And I don't remember which guy he was. And they still have hearings on punitive damages as well as getting Springfield to change the zoning to comply with the Fair Housing Act. So it's a, we know a lot about these community residences, and we know that if they're not clustered on a block and they're licensed, they don't have adverse impacts on property values, neighborhood safety, property turnover rates. I did one study here in Illinois. There have been over 50 studies. They have all come out with roughly the same identical conclusion. And they provide a pretty strong body of evidence that there's no problem allowing group homes as long as they're about a block apart, allowing them as permitted uses. They won't have any adverse impacts. We are not so confident that if they're clustered, concentrated, or unlicensed, that recovery communities and community residents will be so innocuous, absolutely innocuous, harmless. I live next to one, and I actually helped get through the zoning process here in Evanston. I lived at 200 South Boulevard for several years in between my rental and when I got married and we had moved to Dobson. And I led the effort, was their attorney to get them through the zoning process here, and we were 5 years earlier with the earlier group homes and some townhouses on Mile West faced terrible opposition. We actually got through the zoning process with unanimous approval. We nurtured the neighbors, and they were great group homes operated by what was then called the North Shore Association for the Retarded. So Evanston's had a little bit of a touchy issue with history with group homes, but it has generally come through and approved them. But I will tell you, if I were a litigator, I'd be dying to litigate against Evanston's existing community group home zoning, as well as that of every single city in the North Shore. So, the bottom line, we still have this inconvenient truth that, and this is not a political thing, but I'm conveying to you, this is the state of the law. And it is really incumbent for you to take this into consideration with what you are seeking. And I think there are ways to achieve much of what many people are seeking here without losing the city's ability to zone for community residences so that they will be sufficiently separated that they will not interfere with each other's ability to achieve normalization, community integration, and to require licensing and certification to protect the residents from the scam operators. The inconvenient truth is that there just is a tendency for the operators to concentrate the community residences in the least expensive parts of town, especially minority communities, because the property values are being depressed by racial steering. Concentrations occur in neighborhoods and clusters on a block interfere with the ability of these homes to do their job. They create de facto social service districts where the atmosphere can change from residential to institutional. We had in Prescott, Arizona, 221 solar homes in a town of 40,000 people. Until they adopted the zoning that began licensing and it's down to about 50 now. The scam operators left town pretty darn quickly. We feel very confident that they won't affect property values, and as long as they are scattered and licensed. So I realize, I'll save the discussion of what would be legal zoning for after this presentation. If you want me to show you what it would be, it's fairly straightforward. It'll take about 10 minutes to explain. You should be aware that Skokie, which has less restrictive zoning than Evanston's, still runs afoul of the Fair Housing Act, I think. But it's less restrictive than Evanston's, has 38 community residences as of 2014. That's far more than any other North Shore community. Niles, which has similarly valued housing as Skokie, has just 12. It gets ugly. We had a public hearing in Lincolnwood, which has the most incredibly restrictive and illegal zoning for community residences you could possibly imagine. For this accordion, for a home for 6 women with mental disabilities who were very, very mobile. They would go to school or go to work, take the bus, and we went through 8 hours of public hearings on that. It was a living hell. It was not, this is the first hearing where I've actually been jeered. Well, I did get jeered in Wilmette on a loophole zoning hearing about loopholes 20 years ago, where some people said, we don't want to be like Evanston, and all I could think of that was, you should be so lucky to be like Evanston. I guess I should confess, while I did grow up in South Shore in Chicago, I sort of consider Evanston to be my hometown. So we've got this inconvenient truth, but given Evanston's serious commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I would think that city leaders and the public would want to bring Evanston's zoning laws in compliance with the Fair Housing Act while preserving the ability to protect vulnerable people. This isn't being, to protect vulnerable people from abuse, because it is rampant, especially in the sober homes. And I think that there are ways to mitigate some of the concerns. Again, we have an outline afterwards. It'll take about 10 minutes. I realize you're given a lot of time here. How Evanston would do this. But I got a couple of ideas that might satisfy some of the concerns that are raised. For example, being able to establish houses with homeless, unhoused people in them. The city could treat them very similar to the way that I'm going to suggest it should treat community residences. That is, they would be a permitted use in any residential district, subject to a rationally based spacing distance. So you don't have a whole bunch clustered on a block, which would change the character of the neighborhood. And the operator or the shelter itself would be properly licensed or certified. If the state doesn't provide a license, if there is a national organization like with substance abuse disorder, the National Association of Recovery Residences issues certifications. That would do the same job. But you want to make sure that the operators are all legitimate and not mistreating or abusing or exploiting the residents. If you want to locate one within the spacing distance, then the heightened scrutiny of the special use permit would be warranted. And if there's no certification or license available, then the heightened scrutiny of a special use permit would be warranted. But here's the catch. The city would have to adopt special standards for these that are based on the reasons why the special use permit is required. It couldn't use the same old standards it uses for every other special use. The standards for and with the same thing really with community residences. If in the circumstances when a special use would be warranted, you have to have standards based on the reason why you're requiring the special use. They have to, the courts have ruled overwhelmingly, any standards you have to be narrowly tailored, narrowly crafted for these reasons. Now, I also think that Evanston could address the definition of family through a much more inclusive definition. Now, it's not going to satisfy everybody here. obviously, because there are people who want to have any number of people perfectly free to constitute a family. But it can update the scope of the family types while preserving the family atmosphere in residential districts and preserve the legal ability for the city to zone for community residences and recovery communities. And there's no need for me to read these three prongs of the definition, but it basically would allow anybody in a domestic relationship, whether it's sanctioned by law or not, but in reality they're living in a domestic relationship, to occupy a dwelling unit with their children, whether they're biological, adopted, foster, guardianship, etc. But you still have to have some limit on the number of unrelated individuals not living in a domestic partnership in order to preserve the city's ability to have zoning for community residences and recovery communities for people with disabilities. So I realize this, you're going to all have to, with your city council members, figure out what you want to do. I hope this is information that you will take into consideration. It is serious business regarding the community residences and the recovery communities, and the need to be able to protect the residents of those from abusive behavior, exploitation, theft of their income, and the abuses that hopefully will never be as bad as what Kenny Chapman did, is very real. And I'm not being patronizing when I'm saying people with disabilities do constitute a vulnerable population. They do. That's just a fact. And we've got to try to, I would hope that you want to preserve the ability of the city to be able to provide these protections, but again, it's probably just a decision you all got to make. You're lucky folk. And I'm just hoping that this will help infuse the discussion with some factual information. And I want to add one other thing. The case law on zoning for group homes is very fact specific. So the facts in one case may make it not applicable to a different situation. The summary of the case law that I've given you here is based on taking all the cases into account, plus cheating over the years. I've read the briefs that have been filed with courts. So I know the arguments that the two sides are each making, and which arguments, they're reflected in the judge's decisions. The judge's decisions are often lifted straight from the briefs of the plaintiffs or the defendants. So if you want me to go over real quickly what zoning would be appropriate, I'd be happy to do it.
That'd be great.
Okay, I'm going to skip through a few slides that are relevant. Okay, so I'm going to stick with Evanston's cap of 3. Which you can move it up to 4. I don't see any harm in moving it up to 4, certainly. And that would work well actually with the small solar homes and small group homes where you want someone to have a roommate. So any group that fits within the cap of 3 unrelated individuals as a family, it's got to be treated the same as any other family. Any community residence that houses more than 3 people will be able to locate anywhere a residential use can locate in Evanston. And the city cannot require it to have a license and cannot require it to have the city's own license. However, if you want to exceed whatever cap you have, then you have to make this reasonable accommodation that the Fair Housing Act requires, using the least drastic means that actually achieve legitimate government interests. And those legitimate government interests, again, are enabling the homes to function and achieve normalization and community integration, their core values, purposes, and to provide protection for the vulnerable population that lives in these homes. So essentially, Evanston, like most Illinois communities, is way behind the rest of the country on this. Splits group homes by the number of people in a group home. That's something I came up with in 1974. When we were doing zoning for group homes, beta version 0.5. we're now on zoning for group homes version 15. And we realize, and the law has evolved, and what we know about group homes and how they perform has evolved, and we divide them now into a family community residence where tenancy is relatively permanent. People can live there for years. You've got people with developmental disabilities who live in a group home for 30 and 40 years. You've got people living in Oxford houses, the self-governed sober homes, for 5 to 6 years. That's pretty permanent. So typically it's at least a year. Those will be permitted, need to be permitted in all residential districts where residences are allowed, subject to a rationally based spacing distance from any existing community residence or recovery community, and having a license, being certified, or having an actual house charter, which is the equivalent of a license. If both criteria aren't met, then the heightened scrutiny of the special use permit is warranted. And you look at a case-by-case basis. This is all authorized by the Fair Housing Act. The homes that are transitional are relatively transient. We've got sober homes that people live in 21 days after detox. We've got some that's just a couple of months. So that's, in terms of performance, much more what you would expect in a multifamily district, and less of what you would expect in a single-family district, which tend to be more stable. So they would have to be allowed in all districts where multifamily housing is allowed, subject to the same spacing license requirements. And a lot of the single-family districts, if they could show that they would fit in. You can't just ban them from single-family districts. And the standards for deciding all this have to be based on why you're requiring the special use permit. If they don't meet both criteria, you need the special use permit. If you set a cap of 10 people in the community residence, we're very confident it's going to be able to have a family, and someone needs to have more than 10, or wants to have more than 10, then you do a case-by-case examination. And the standards are basically pretty simple. They're really determined by the courts. If they need to have more than 10 people for therapeutic viability or for financial viability, not just to make a bigger profit, but just to be able to make a decent enough profit, and they can still emulate a family, you got it allowed. So that's really a basic standard. You've got these are the 4 circumstances where a special use permit can be required. But again, the vast majority of the community residences would be allowed as a right because they'll be outside of the spacing distance and they'll be licensed or certified. If you add homeless shelters to that mix, then the vast majority of those will also be allowed as a right, as permitted uses. These standards, as I said, need to be carefully crafted. Heeding the wise words of Mancini and the Princess Bride, to Fezzik and Inigo Montoya, when you get lost, always go back to the beginning. So those standards have to be very narrowly drawn. And that's, I think, well, this just illustrates what you would have to do if you wanted to have more than what the zoning ordinance allows as a right for a community residence. Because let's not kid ourselves. There's probably no way on earth 15, 16, 17, 20, and 30 people are going to emulate a family. Let's not kid ourselves. But 10 or 12, there's a damn good chance, and maybe 13 or 14, you can do it. But you should have the opportunity to show on a case-by-case basis that you can do that. So that's an extraordinarily brief summary of what is, I think, the maximum regulation a city or a county can do regarding community residences and recovery communities for people with disabilities. Recovery communities are a little bit different, and I don't want to keep you for the discussion of them, but it's the same basic principle, but they wouldn't be allowed in single-family districts, just in multifamily districts and institutional districts. And the spacing distance would be larger because they're larger aggregations of people, and they have a wider influence. So I hope this gives you something to chew on and think about. And I really appreciate you keeping your eyes open and not starting to slow. Especially since so many of you have masks on, you could have gotten away with falling asleep during this presentation.
Thank you very much. So yeah, we'll take.
I have one question for Councilman Kelly, actually. So as we've heard of some of these other housing needs that people have, where like-minded people would be wanting to live in one place, Would that be something that could potentially be considered by a special use? So that somebody could come and present, so to make sure that we don't have every house on the block being that. Could that be special use?
As long as we have, well, I'll let you.
Yeah.
I think it's not, I think we remove the definition of family. Right?
No, I mean, leave it, putting
Right.
special, having the definition of family in place,
Right.
having the 3-person limit.
And have
But
it,
if there are circumstances that lead that, or, certainly, I'm just gonna make tax assessment, lots of people. to get it. I mean, if there's a situation, there can be a crafted special use built into this.
yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
If I may add to that, you could, I mean, there's several ways you could do this as special use. You could also make it as a right, with a spacing distance. Similarly, all this talk about eliminating single-family zoning, which is really twisting the phrase, kind of like funding the police was twisting the phrase, they were going to eliminate funding the police, no, it's changing police practices. You could allow multifamily housing in single-family districts, limiting the number of multifamily buildings on a block face with the two sides of the block. And that way you wouldn't have whole blocks getting torn down and converted into multifamily housing. What you need to be aware of that the cities that have so-called eliminated single-family housing, it hasn't worked out very well. It is not producing affordable housing, it's producing expensive multifamily housing. And you need to be aware that the only way any jurisdiction is really going to get affordable housing that will stay affordable in the long run is to convert existing buildings, multifamily buildings, into low-equity co-ops, the most successful affordable housing program in this nation's history. And take single-family homes and townhouses and convert those into mutual housing associations. Both of those keep them affordable in perpetuity to the same income cohort that was aimed at in the first place. Park Forest is a great example where they converted 2,000 units of duplexes, low-equity co-op in the mid-60s, 2,000 units stayed rental, and then they were converted to condominium. Condominiums are slums now because they were sold to people with very low, relatively low incomes and low prices with very low down payments who couldn't afford to own them. And the low-equity co-ops, the cost of a shared unit was still just $800, have been a rousing success for years. And what happens is that people live in them as they get upwardly mobile, make more money, they save money so that they can buy a home on their own without any government subsidy. Sort of the old-fashioned way. And it's good for the homeowner, it's good for the taxpayer, and it keeps the housing, when they leave it, it's still affordable to people in their income group that they were in when they started out. And that's the problem we got with subsidized housing. Once that subsidy ends, it goes market rate, you lose it. And then you go through the whole process of let's subsidize more housing to replace it. Why not be a little more, here I'm making a recommendation, why not be a little bit more cost effective and rational and put the housing into a form that would keep it affordable. The National Co-op Bank has the funds available. In Washington, D.C., they have saved a ton of units because they have a law in effect since 1980 that gives tenants right of first refusal to buy their building. And if they convert to low-equity co-op, the city uses its community development block grant money to give them, pay the soft costs of converting low-equity co-op, the architects, the engineers, the lawyers, of course. And it's paid back to the community development block grant fund when they get their permanent financing. It has survived 2 court tests. The only problem is that it's been so successful that the city there actually fired Rita Hickey, the first director of it, because she was doing such a good job. I'm not making this up. And they have suppressed this program for years because of lobbying from the real estate industry. But it's unbelievably effective. They've saved thousands and thousands of units, and it's a great tool to use in the face of gentrification. Because if you convert the housing to low-equity cooperative housing associations, it stays affordable. to the people who were there. And you know, as you know, probably well aware, you know, everyone who buys a home, this is your biggest investment you ever made. You have to lower your income, it's even a bigger investment for you. And you want to make money from your home, so you've got that conflict and tension between using the home to make wealth and keeping housing affordable. And the law would be called Mutual Housing Association solves that tension. So I'm going to encourage the advocates here to encourage the city to try to start acquiring apartments and townhouses and single-family homes and convert them to what we call Mutual Housing Associations. The money is available there.
Yes. Can you, I haven't thought this completely through, but in the example that you gave towards the end of your lecture, can you bifurcate the rules? So for example, to use the 3 and 4 numbers that you were using, do 4 for properties where people sign a year's lease versus 3 for, you're shaking your head no. No?
I doubt
No? Why?
I doubt it very much.
I'm sorry, what?
I doubt it very much.
Okay, because?
I want to do some research, but I don't think that you can have a definition of family that would vary the number of unrelated people that can live together based on the length of the lease. I can't quite fathom how that could possibly be legal. It's an interesting idea, though.
Uh-huh. Well, it wouldn't, the family would be the same, but you're talking about being able to license and zone community residences and sober houses and so forth. But you're saying that you couldn't do that based on the length of time that people stay in a sober house, for example.
No, in the, okay. This is exhausting. With group homes, for example, community residences, we divide them into the family and transition based on how they perform, whether they're relatively permanent or relatively temporary housing. We don't base it on the number of people in the home. That was, as I said, that's something I came up with in 1974. We were really struggling to figure out how to reform zoning for group homes because most cities were not allowing them in single-family districts or requiring a special use permit all the time. And we looked at fire codes, and they made it differentiated between 8 and 9. So we made the more permissible zoning for those of 8 or fewer, more restrictive zoning for those of 9 or more. And the law, once the Fair Housing Amendments Act was passed in '88, that was blatantly illegal, but it wasn't really appropriate even before that, as we learned more about group homes and how they function.
Carlos?
Yes. I would like to have an explanation about the advantage rather than co-ops, since we have a lot of available land that's about to be transitioned in the 5th Ward, and they're considering it to be a TIF. What could we do as elderly residents who want to remain in this community to demand the city of Evanston put a minimum of 35% of that development into the land trust, where people could have an affordable home for the next 100 years. As I sit here now, see $600,000 townhouses across the street from me. I'm like the Indians sending the smoke signals when they see the covered wagons coming. It's time for us to get out of here. But we have never, ever, I don't know, I think there's less than, what, 10 land trusts in this community, Betty?
No, we have, right now there's 22 units here in Evanston. How many of those are single-family owned houses? I don't know. Don't hold that against me, although I sit on the board. I haven't been to the meetings. But we do have homes that are in the land trust. And we have been pushing the aldermen that the units that they plan to build, create there on the corner of Jackson and Emerson, that should go into the land trust.
Yes.
Because if they don't, the families which have now are elderly will be eventually forced out. Because if they stay as market value, those people property tax will go up and force them out. They put them in the land trust, they don't have to face that issue. Carlos is asking from 35, I'm saying it should be all.
I would, it's basically a political decision. You've got to pressure the city council to do that. If it
It's
makes
a moral
sense.
decision because what has happened to this community, not to the seniors that stays over there in Fifth Ward, but we're looking at what is happening to the seniors all over. And they are looking at, well, I'm gonna have to leave. Well, they don't have to leave. What they can do is sell their house to the community land trust and stay in that house, pay a little $25 a month for the land. Work out a deal, you stay there. And when they pass the zone, that house is affordable.
Yeah, I'm going to make a suggestion that you put this idea in my head that will probably get me shot. So don't all go hitting me over the head or anything or throwing things at me. But in a certain sense, that might be a very good use of the reparations money.
Well,
You know, you might want to be looking at
I
that.
want cash payments.
I don't want to get mixed up in the debate over that. I don't think there's any way to issue enough reparations for what this country has done. But, you know, being realistic about limited funds available, that might be one of the uses that could be used. The key is making it so it can stay.
Could use that to say, I want to buy affordable housing, and I can use that $30,000. If you're buying it from the land trust, you having a bigger value of that down payment because they're not buying that land. They probably buying the house that's only going to be for $160,000, maybe $180,000. Whereas if they got to go on the open market, $30,000 is not going to buy them a home.
That's why organizing the ownership as a mutual holding association would help do the trick, make a world of difference.
Yeah, I think that's a fabulous idea, and I think other people should be encouraged to put their properties in land trust as opposed to, you know, having that go to their children. You know, I mean, people all over the city could do that, and we'd be a lot better off. But my question is, how the whole analysis you have, which is really oriented to the ramifications on group homes and recovery centers, where in that can we relate to the student housing problem, which is the issue around which this whole thing comes up in terms of the 3 unrelated rule and the definition of family? I mean, that one of the reasons why, my understanding, this subcommittee got started was to look at licensing as an alternative to licensing and some kind of regulation. As an alternative to the 3 unrelated, to protect against the misuse of property and the you know, all the problems that people have in the community when there's concentrated student housing. But is there some kind of extrapolation you can make of what you were talking about to that issue? It's a cluster issue, but it's not one that can be resolved because the housing is around where people go to school. So you can't really kind of require students to live, 5 miles away. So how does this relate?
I'm with you on that bad thing about 5 miles away. The darn law school is 15 miles away. My purpose here was to explain the consequences of abolishing the rule. I think that with some innovative thinking, it's possible to come up with ways to provide more student housing that would have to be, obviously, fairly near the university, because you don't want to prepare students for real life by having them commute for half an hour each day. And but I think we could do some brainstorming about that. I think it's feasible to come up with something. I know that Berkeley, California is required, they passed a law requiring the university to provide more housing. That's one approach that could be used, but I think that, with all the, I know Evanston's still got an awful lot of very, very innovative, thoughtful people. I hate to use this phrase, look outside the box, it's a terrible cliche, but I think that we could come up with some, ways to address that, which will still preserve your abilities to zone for community residences and require licensing for them.
And could I just add to that? I think the very important point being here, and jump in and correct me, but I understand, people, this concept of, we lift the lid, we lift the definition of family, but I feel like this has been made very clear that we would lose our ability to protect vulnerable people from abuse if we do this, as he's laid out. We would also lose our ability to space. And I think that's I think we have to carefully craft something for Evanston. And I'm not sure exactly what that's going to look like, but including rooming houses. But we won't be able to space even those rooming houses if we live. And I agree, we have to rewrite the definition of family, and I don't know, 3 or 4 if we change that number. But I think that's really key, because if we're going to, if we want to have the ability to space, and as well as have the ability to protect the vulnerable, we need to keep that definition in some form and a limit. So I think we can accommodate students. I know there is one, is David? Is David here? David Gillette? Hi, yes.
I'm Barbara Blades from the Fairman's Park neighborhood, and we started working with the university 15, 20 years ago. And finally, they started requiring sophomores to live on campus. And then they had a plan to require juniors to live on campus, and they were renovating different buildings on the campus to do that. And then the new president was coming in, and she thought that the students would have a better experience if they all lived on campus, and that was her plan. But she became ill, and now she won't be there. I don't know if she won't be there at all.
Today they announced it.
Oh, they did? I haven't seen that. So they are working on it, and that would give our neighborhoods a lot of relief. And housing could go to families again, like it did. It was 1990 when all this started. I've lived there since '70.
Thank you.
That's the history.
And I think part of it is, there's also abuse of the students. And I do think we need to somehow figure out a way to do a better job of regulating and inspecting these houses. As we know, these large portfolio, these absentee landlords with lots of houses. I've seen it. There's a lot of abuse. These are young students who haven't lived on their own before. And it's a pretty good deal for these landlords that live somewhere else, sometimes out of state, that own 20 houses. They don't, nobody's calling and complaining because oftentimes. I know, again, my son lived in 2 of these off-campus houses, so, I mean, I think we have to do a better job of regulating and monitoring and also ensuring that these students aren't subject to this, crazy abuse. As we know, as was mentioned, that they pack students in, make upwards of $10,000, distorting rent, actually making it more expensive, even distorting sale prices. We have seen in the neighborhood how it's listed way above what is market rate because they're advertising that you can make this much per month. So so they even distort the price. So I think we have to be careful when we talk about this idea of lifting the definition of family in terms of somehow supporting affordability. I mean, I do think I'm really grateful to understand this. I think none of us want to lose our ability to preserve, to protect vulnerable people. And I also think we need to look at spacing more. And we can do that with student housing, we could do that with rooming houses. We currently have, so that you do have an RA, as opposed to once you live that live, then we can't regulate, we can't discriminate and say, create a dorm. Like, there's nothing we can say about that in terms of an RA, or even worse, for the elderly, or all the examples that Attorney Lober gave us. And I think that's really important, but I think we do need to think of something that's very tailored and protective of the vulnerable for Evanston. I think we can do it. I think that's what that's really what this initially formed. That's why we're here with the subcommittee, to figure that out. What will work for Evanston so that we can address the needs of primarily affordability and protect also the vulnerable. And so I do think we have to be careful. I would like to see us look at spacing for group homes, for rooming houses. And I think we do need to redefine, maybe we could, I think we do need to redefine, write a new definition of family. Yes?
Just one other comment as I've been listening to all this. Isn't the current one that's published out there, where we change things to dwelling units, isn't that detrimental to families? Because if you have to have certain spacing for bedrooms and stuff with people, if you have a larger family in a smaller house, isn't it detrimental to have that the one that we've got currently in place? So right now we're not talking about family at all. We're talking about dwelling units and people living in a dwelling unit.
It still applies to dwelling units.
Right. But a dwelling unit that would have a larger family, if it was a family unit, they would be able to stay in it. If we're looking at just bedrooms and people, they may not be able to stay in it.
Are you speaking about the city's code that requires 70 square feet in a bedroom and 50 additional feet? Yeah, that's extremely common, and that was the Supreme Court made it very clear that was not subject to the Fair Housing Act because it applied equally to all residential units. So those, even with say a community residence or say a license, you're only allowed 10 people in it, as a right. If you really put 8 people in it under the housing code or property maintenance code, that's all you can put in there, because it applies to everyone. And that's got some basis in health and safety, because it does prevent overcrowding. I know there are ethnographers who don't like that because you've got some people who have immigrated here, especially from Southeast Asia. They're used to having a whole lot more people in a home, and they're used to being very crowded. So they're saying, well, that's not fair to them, that's discriminatory, but it's not a violation of the Fair Housing Act, and this is housing here in the US. And if there's some Southeast Asian country and they're worried about overcrowding a house, creating unsafe conditions, that's not something that should be carried over to our laws. But anyway, I think there are creative solutions available that could satisfy almost everybody's concerns. I think that it is possible. It's going to take a lot of work, but it's possible to come up with ways to provide for shared housing that would not eliminate the definition of family and the cap in the definition of family, but I think there's ways that you could draft ordinance language that would permit that and preserve the city's ability to zone for and require spacing and licensing to protect the people in the community residences. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to be really innovative, but I have no doubt it can be done. but it's gonna really take a lot of brain power. We're gonna use a lot of gray matter doing it, but it can be done. It's just a matter of the city's political will, if it wants to put the time and money into doing that.
Any other questions? Thank you. This, we'll continue on with this next month, probably for several months. I'm guessing for a couple months we'll be at this, but please feel free to, I think on our website there is a group email. I made an email for all the committee members, so if you want to email us documents or questions, it was up there anyway, so, yeah, okay. So please post it. Okay, thank you very much everybody for coming this evening.